Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 64. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 6 and 7 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the voluntary and the involuntary and the circumstances of human acts. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. And for the next couple of episodes, we will be treating of human acts, or all that is entailed in our voluntary actions. And so at the beginning of this new subsection, if we can call it that, within the Prima Secundae, St. Thomas gives us the following introduction. Since therefore happiness is to be gained by means of certain acts, we must in due sequence consider human acts in order to know by what acts we may obtain happiness, and by what acts we are prevented from attaining it. The study of morals, therefore, since it treats of human acts, should consider first the general principles and secondly matters of detail. And today we begin by setting out some of those principles. Article 1, whether there is anything voluntary in human acts. Voluntary action means, according to Aquinas, not only as having a principle within the agent, but also as implying knowledge. Therefore, since man especially knows the end of his work and moves himself, in his acts especially is the voluntary to be found. We move ourselves, unlike the inanimate and unlike the irrational, we move ourselves by first understanding, knowing that to which we are directing ourselves to, then willing that thing, which is proved to us by our own experience of ourselves acting voluntarily. And it is worth mentioning here that even though we will necessarily our own happiness, as well as necessarily must be moved to that end by the unmoved mover of all things, i.e. God, neither this our ultimate final end, happiness, nor our ultimate first cause, God, undermine our free will because of the definition of voluntariness, which again is a definition proved by experience. In St. Thomas's words, God moves man to act, because every movement either of the will or of nature proceeds from God, as from the first mover, and just as it is not incompatible with nature that the natural movement be from God as the first mover, so it is not contrary to the essence of a voluntary act that it proceed from God, inasmuch as the will is moved by God. Nevertheless, both natural and voluntary movements have this in common, that it is essential that they should proceed from a principle within the agent. Article 2, whether there is anything voluntary in irrational animals. Briefly and in response to this article, St. Thomas says, the will is the name of the rational appetite, and consequently it cannot be in things devoid of reason. The deer runs away from the wolf based on instinct, what we have called the estimative interior sense. The deer first apprehends via its external senses the color, sound, smell of the wolf, and then just knows, or to be more precise, perceives a threat instinctively. It perceives via this interior sense, the estimative sense built into its nature, that this particular combination of color, smell, sound is harmful to it. And therefore, insofar as irrational animals' actions proceed by a kind of knowledge of things, this perception that we've discussed by this interior sense, we can say, as Aquinas says, that they have a kind of similarity to voluntariness, or a kind of participated voluntariness, even though irrational animals do not, strictly speaking, act voluntarily. Article 3, whether there can be voluntariness without any act. Is a sign and result of our voluntariness also our not willing? And it is. St. Thomas writes, the word voluntary is applied to that of which we are masters. Now we are masters in respect of to act and to not act, to will and not to will. Therefore, just as to act and to will are voluntary, so also are not to act and not to will. So we can choose to go right or to go left or not choose. All are examples of voluntariness, which is why sins of omission or faults of not doing or not willing are truly sins, which man can be culpable for, as Jesus says in Matthew 25, "Truly I say to you, as you did it not to one of the least of these, you did it not to me. And they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life." Article 4, whether violence can be done to the will. What we mean by violence in this article is the following. What is compelled from an exterior principle? Can our will be coerced from the outside? Now we know that the movement of our physical bodies can be violently moved in a way contrary to us and without our action, but that is because the body is material. It takes up space and therefore is directly susceptible to physical influence. But the will is an entirely immaterial faculty of the soul, and so the act of the will, to will or not to will, must come from us. It must come from the inside. It cannot be coerced by some external created thing. St. Thomas writes, "As to the will's own proper act, violence cannot be done to the will. The reason of this is that the act of the will is nothing else than an inclination proceeding from the interior principle of knowledge. And so, since it proceeds from an interior principle, the intellect, the will must necessarily come from the inside, from us, and cannot be violently moved from the outside." Article 5, whether violence causes involuntariness. And we know in some ways, at least physically, it can. If a man forces my hand to pull a lever, which then leads to some evil result, which I did not will, then this evil act for me was involuntary. As we've mentioned, the body can be compelled, although the will itself, which is above external violent influence, cannot. And yet, since to will a thing consists not only, in Aquinas' words, to wish something, but also in those acts of the will commanded by it and put into execution by means of some other power, such as to walk or to speak, in this second sense, in the acts commanded to occur by our will, involuntariness can occur through the hindering influence of others on those acts. Article 6, whether fear causes involuntariness simply. Our guide in this question is the following words from St. Thomas. "It is clear, therefore, that in what is done from compulsion, the will does nothing inwardly, whereas in what is done through fear, the will does something. So fear does not cause involuntariness because in choosing some desired good for the sake of avoiding some evil, or out of fear, we are still willing some desired good, and so fear does not destroy our voluntariness. Now, we may will something that we wouldn't have if we hadn't been afraid, but insofar as we are still willing, and not by some interior violence to the will, which cannot occur, we retain our voluntariness, even in the midst of great fear." Article 7, whether concupiscence causes involuntariness. What is concupiscence? In short, we could translate the term to mean desire, or sometimes is taken to mean inordinate desire specifically. So if the last article asked if fear involuntarizes our actions, if that's a word, then this article is asking if desire can. And in both cases, the answer is no. St. Thomas responds, briefly writing, "Concupiscence does not cause involuntariness, but on the contrary makes something to be voluntary. For a thing is said to be voluntary from the fact that the will is moved to it. Now concupiscence inclines the will to desire the object of concupiscence. Therefore, the effect of concupiscence is to make something to be voluntary rather than involuntary." Article 8, whether ignorance causes involuntariness. This question is likely to be more interesting to us than the previous two because the answer is less intuitive. Beginning with Aristotle, he writes, "What is done through ignorance is involuntary." However, then Aquinas, in his usual astute manner, gives us the relevant distinctions, and he considers ignorance from three different perspectives. Ignorance preceding choice, that's antecedent ignorance. Ignorance following upon choice, that's consequent ignorance. And then lastly, there is what St. Thomas terms concomitant ignorance, which he defines as an ignorance which would not affect choice, even if it was absent. And he gives us the following example. For instance, a man may kill a foe whom he wishes to kill, thinking at the time that he is killing a stag. So a man wanting to kill his foe, but shooting what he thinks to be a stag and actually killing his foe, would not have chosen differently, even if he had known that what he was shooting was his foe and not in fact the stag. According to our scenario, he would have taken the shot either way, and this is an example of concomitant ignorance. Aquinas says of this ignorance of this kind, as Aristotle states, does not cause involuntariness, since it is not the cause of anything that is repugnant to the will, but it causes non-voluntariness, since that which is unknown cannot be actually willed, which is kind of interesting. Then when it comes to those other two kinds of ignorance, we can begin with antecedent ignorance. This is a kind of ignorance that goes before choice, simply, such as after taking prudent precaution, actually running over someone who throws themselves into the road. This ignorance is the cause of involuntariness in regard to the action done, because one would not have presumably acted the same, done what he did, had he known more about what was going on or what was forthcoming. Lastly is the culpable kind of ignorance, what Aquinas calls consequent ignorance. This is a willed ignorance of things that one ought to know, or even things one is ignorant of due to culpable vice. This kind of ignorance is our fault, and therefore cannot be said to cause involuntariness in man. In Aquinas' words, ignorance of this kind happens either when one does not actually consider what one can and ought to consider, and this is called ignorance of evil choice, and arises from some passion or habit, or when one does not take the trouble to acquire the knowledge which one ought to have, in which sense ignorance of the general principles of law, which one ought to know, is voluntary as being due to negligence. Accordingly, if in either of these ways ignorance is voluntary, it cannot cause involuntariness simply. And with that, we move on to question 7 of the circumstances of human acts. Article 1, whether a circumstance is an accident of a human act. And what we mean by accident here, Aquinas tells us, he says, what is outside a thing's substance, while it belongs to that thing, is called its accident. So a substance can be defined, and this is from Father Clark, a well-known Catholic philosopher, this way: the essence, considered as that which renders a being apt to exist in itself and not another, which therefore functions as the principle of unity, holding together all its various attributes. So, as the rational animal, which is the definition of our essence, human, our substance is our soul informing the matter of our body. This constitutes a human being existing in itself. And then everything else about us, everything that flows from that substance or comes along with it, we call our accidental attributes. That would include our particular height, our weight, our knowledge, our virtues, our vices, all of these things, and many others that are in or on us or in some way related to our substance, we call accidents. In a similar way, those things surrounding our actions, for example, the way in which the action was done, the place and the time it was done, those things entailed in or around the substance or essence of the act, we call it circumstances. Aquinas makes that comparison specific in the following words. The particular conditions of any singular thing are called its individuating accidents, but the philosopher, that's Aristotle, calls the circumstances particular things, i.e. the particular conditions of each act. Therefore, the circumstances are individual accidents of human acts. Article 2, whether theologians should take note of the circumstances of human acts. Yes, because circumstances, and specifically knowledge of circumstances by the one who conducted the act, can affect that act greatly. As St. Thomas says, ignorance of circumstances causes an act to be involuntary, but involuntariness excuses from sin, the consideration of which belongs to the theologian. Therefore, circumstances also should be considered by the theologian. So the theologian must be able to give an accurate analysis of the action that actually occurred, whether in accord to the species of it, what kind of act it was, the sinfulness or merit of it, as well as ignorance or circumstances caused to make one more or less voluntary. For all of these reasons, the theologian should take note of the circumstances of human acts. Article 3, whether the circumstances are properly set forth in the third book of the Ethics. The article refers to the Ethics written by Aristotle, and Aquinas answers in the affirmative and then gives a slightly truncated list of those circumstances as given by Cicero, which is who, what, where, by what aids, why, how, and when. For in acts we must take note of who did it, by what aids or instruments he did it, what he did, where he did it, why he did it, how and when he did it. And possibly the most important part of this article is the distinction between what was done and why a thing was done in constituting the essence of the act, as opposed to those same considerations merely as circumstances or surrounding or modifying in a non-essential way that same act. So what a man did, like taking another's property, by defining the object as theft, is not so much a circumstance, but included in the substance of the act. However, that a man take more or less of another man's property is without a doubt a circumstance. In the same way, why a man did a thing, like the act of courage for the sake of Christ in the form of martyrdom, is not so much a circumstance, but essential to the action itself. However, that he also did so as an encouragement to his Christian brothers standing by, or as a means to evangelization, is a circumstance surrounding the event, which leads us to our last article of this question. Article 4, whether the most important circumstances are why and in what the act consists. In Aquinas' words, acts are properly called human inasmuch as they are voluntary. Now the motive and object of the will is the end. Therefore, that circumstance is the most important of all which touches the act on the part of the end, the circumstance, why. And the second in importance is that which touches the very substance of the act, the circumstance, what he did. And the key here again is to distinguish the motivation or intention essential to the object of that action, which constitutes its substance, versus those other considerations of why and in what an action consisted, considered merely as circumstances. For example, the sexual act, what was done, as directed intentionally to a non-spouse, is not in this case just a circumstance, but enters into the very substance or definition of the act, which is adultery. Also, the intention or why a man is walking down the street, whether to go to Mass or to murder an innocent person, is not merely a circumstance of his walking down the street, but entering again into the very substance of the act, as an act of justice or injustice, a journey to worship, or a journey to murder the innocent. As well explained as an instructional footnote in the Gilby Summa, it is written, those two circumstances which are nearest object and end are, it is argued, capital circumstance. However, they cease to be circumstances if they merge into the object and end. On the other hand, the circumstances affecting the object is a quality investing in an already constituted moral object, and the circumstantial accessories here do nothing to alter the fundamental rights and wrongs in these matters. Likewise, the circumstance affecting the end, called here ulterior motive, is not the end of the act considered in itself, for example, in murder, the direct taking of an innocent life, but a more adventitious and local purpose, for example, murder to remove a hated rival. And we will have many more questions in this volume of the Summa to consider human actions as well as their moral character, but that does it for this episode. We have just finished covering questions 6 and 7 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the voluntary and the involuntary, and of the circumstances of human acts. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.